Hi again, everybody. It's day 48 of my vlog. It's in the wilderness, a mediator. And this is from Numbers 14, 13 through 19. We were looking at 2 vlogs ago that the wilderness is endless monotony. In Numbers 14, God's people want to quit. And in verse 10, they want to kill God's leaders. Moses, Aaron, Joshua, and Caleb. They can't hurt God, so we'll hurt his leaders. And that is a dangerous place to be. And God responds in verses 11 and 12. He says, I quit. I've had enough. Let me smite them back and do it hard. People don't think that God has those thoughts and feelings, but God's a real person. And one of the greatest prayers in the Bible follows what God says to Moses, that he says, let me smite them. And I love the prayer. Verses 13 through 19, Moses steps forward and prays to God that he show mercy and pardon God's people. Verse 19, that's the end of it, where he says, pardon them. The verse says, pardon, I beseech thee, the iniquity of this people according to the greatness of thy mercy. And as thou hast forgiven this people from Egypt even until now. In other words, you've been forgiving them over and over again. Keep it up. Moses becomes the mediator between God and God's people. I count 4 reasons in those verses that Moses tells to God why God should pardon his people for their iniquity. Now you have to understand, he's asking for pardoning for the iniquity. He's not really saying forget the transgression. There's going to be consequences. But the iniquity is the brokenness, the nature of God's people that just leads them to be like they are. So the first reason is, and I think this is a powerful thing to say to God, people will think that God cannot finish the salvation that he started with his people and for his people. That's verse 16. In other words, God started something, he wasn't big enough and strong enough to finish it. I think God hears that. I know he hears that. Paul says, faithful is he that calls you, who also will finish it, will do it. Verse 17, Moses says, God, you need to be great or bigger than you already are. In other words, you have to be bigger in action than you are in your words. You promised, you said you'd do this. Follow through. And it's not like God was going to lie, because God doesn't lie. And number 3, I ask you to answer this prayer and pardon your people just because I'm asking you to. It's what I would like this. We forget that prayer is we have the gift of just saying, God, I'd like you to do something. And Moses says, I'm asking. That's verse 19. And then he reminds God that God is in the habit of forgiving sins. What's one more time? And God hears Moses' prayer and forgives and pardons. That's verse 20. God is always looking for someone to do what Moses did. Someone to step up, to be a mediator, an intercessor, to stand for men before God. Ezekiel 22:30 says, God says, I am looking for a man to stand in the gap between me and people. Just one man in the whole world. God says, you can stand between me and everybody. And that man will build a hedge of prayer. That is, he'll give me a reason to be merciful. Daniel did that in the book of Daniel for his people, for God's people. Moses was that man in Numbers 14. 1 Timothy 2:5 tells us that Jesus is that man forever. It says, for there is one God and one mediator between God and man. That is, the one God is Jesus, and the one man is Jesus, and the one mediator is Jesus, who stands between God and man, makes intercession for God's people and prays for them. That's the man. That man is Christ Jesus, according to the verse. It's just a wonderful thought to know that Jesus is always standing there forever. He's committed to it for you and I. So God is still looking for mediators to intercede in prayer for other people. He's looking for one man, one woman to stand in the gap between God and somebody else. Who in your life can you stand in the gap for and pray for and ask God to be merciful to? I want to add this thought. It's a kind of a bonus. I often have the option of praying God get them or God be merciful. Sometimes it's easier to want God just to get somebody. And he would hear that prayer, not necessarily the way you want him to. But God is looking for a man to stand in the gap and say, be merciful. Will that person be you?